Hello, and welcome to the 9th episode of the second series of Among the Ancients, a close reading series from the London Review of Books with Emily Wilson and me, Thomas Jones. This time, we're talking about Tacitus, who is now generally seen, as Mary Beard once put it in a piece for the LRB, as the most acute, cynical, and hard-headed ancient analyst of Roman political power. We'll be looking in particular at the Annals, his last book, which gives a detailed account of the 50 years or so from the death of the Emperor Augustus in 14 AD to the death of Nero in 68, although a complete text has not survived. There are 4 or 5 books missing from the middle. Caligula's reign is entirely absent, unfortunately, and it breaks off a couple of years before the end. But there's plenty of great stuff in what does survive on Tiberius, the second half of Claudius's reign, and most of Nero's. But before we get to all that, Emily, who was Tacitus and how soon after the events he describes was he writing?
Yeah, so he was writing significantly later than the events he describes, and he sort of presents it at the start of the Annals as if this gives him a quasi-objective perspective. He famously says that he's writing sine ira et studio, so without rage or prejudice, because he's got this historical position on these events of a couple of generations earlier. He lived from the mid-50s AD to around 120 or maybe a little bit later AD. So he's writing after all of these emperors are long dead.
And as well as a historian, he held political office?
He held political office as well. So he was, I think just for understanding the style of the Annals, it's important to know that he was very well educated in oratory. He was a close friend of the also writer Pliny the Younger. He zoomed up the cursus honorum, the career ladder of the elite Romans. He was a suffect consul, meaning that he was chosen to be a consul. He was apparently the first in his family to get that kind of high office. And he eventually got a, again, highly esteemed governorship in what was then called Asia in Western Anatolia.
And his father-in-law, is that right, was Agricola, who did a lot of the conquering of Britain.
That's right, yes. Whom he writes about, yes. So one of his earlier works is the Agricola. It's a sort of paean to his father-in-law, and it's also a very important source for Roman Britain, and it's the most vivid account of Boadicea, rule Britannia, and the whole sort of account of how this glorious Roman governor tried to keep order against the wild people of Britain.
And what were the other books that he wrote, or that we still have that he wrote before the Annals? Because it was his 5th surviving work.
Yes, so we also have the, so right before the Annals, he had done the Histories, which is sort of confusingly is later in terms of its own setting, but was written before the Annals. And before either the Annals or the Histories, he had written both the Agricola, the Germania, again, focused on another area of Roman imperial rule. And he'd also, this is debatable because some people say maybe it isn't by him, but he also had written the Dialogue on Orators, the Dialogos, which is different from his historical and provincial works in that it's a dialogue. It's stylistically a bit different. It's a dialogue about why is oratory no good anymore? Can oratory only flourish under chaotic systems of government? And now that we have the lovely autocracy of the Principate, then we can't have good literature. What a shame.
And you mentioned already that the Histories covers a later historical period, sort of picks up where the Annals breaks off. So in one sense, the Annals could be thought of as a sort of prequel to the Histories, though that's rather downplaying it. And it's more often seen as a culmination of Tacitus's work. That, again, in that piece in the LRB, Mary Beard called it his most daring attempt to find a new Latin language for the analysis of the corruption and the disintegration of morality that imperial autocracy heralded. So what did Tacitus think history was for? What was he trying to do in these historical works?
Yeah, that's the difficult question to sort of sum up, and I hope that maybe when going through passages we can try and dig into that a little bit. I think there's some really deep ambiguities and ironies in all of Tacitus's historical works, including the early ones, about the degree to which it's a sort of indictment of the system under which he himself lived. And he lived through the Emperor Domitian and managed to survive the various purges and assassinations from that emperor. It's not as if anyone comes out very well in these historical accounts of the horrors of the Principate and Empire. And yet, at the same time, Tacitus seems to sort of constantly give us this multiplicity of ways of looking at it. Is it that the Principate is a horrible system, or is it just the worst system apart from all the other systems? and that maybe there's no way out from the oppression and everyone watching everyone else and corruption and autocracy. I mean, I think one of the big themes of the Annals that runs through his work is the failures of the Senate, that he was very much interested in what kinds of role can elite men who are very highly trained in oratory have politically. And within the system that he's evoking in both the histories and the Annals, the role is more or less nothing except brown nose the emperor or kill yourself. And so the problems of that are evoked very vividly in all of Tacitus's work in different ways. And then also the sort of political question of, is it better to be a free barbarian like Boadicea or these various barbarian quasi-heroes who pop up throughout the histories and the Annals, than to be a craven Roman senator who has to pretend to have some kind of negligible political power to pretend that the Principate isn't as autocratic and awful as it clearly is.
But one of the things many things that isn't entirely clear is whether or not it's a problem with the system that if you have an emperor who's pretending not to be an emperor, the Senate is essentially powerless, so the senators can't help behaving in this craven way. Or if the problem is that the senators have such weak characters that if you had better men in the Senate, maybe the system would be improved. And it's not clear which.
Exactly. I mean, I think he's always hovering on that line and he's constantly giving you both sides of that. And then the same parallel question about the emperors themselves. Is the problem that Nero is a monster, or is it a problem that the system is set up to make people into monsters, even if they weren't entirely monstrous to start with, even though most of these people have that capacity for monstrosity. But if absolute power corrupts absolutely, seems to be the lesson of quite a lot of these stories that we get in Tacitus.
Should we listen to a reading now? Maybe a bit from quite early on in book 1, where he's thinking about the legacy of Augustus and he's weighing up different opinions of the first emperor and not quite coming down on either side himself, although we can talk about what.
Yeah, let's talk about which side he might come down on. And this speaks to the question we've just been discussing of, is he really without any studium, without any taking sides when he presents two different sides?
And this is in Michael Grant's translation for Penguin Classics.
Then there was much discussion of Augustus himself. Most people were struck by meaningless points, such as the coincidence between the dates of his first public office and his death, and the fact that he died in the same house and room at Nola as his father, Gaius Octavius. There was also talk about his numerous consulships, which equalled the combined totals of Marcus Valerius Corvus and Gaius Marius, of his tribune's power continuous for 37 years, of the 21 times he was hailed as victor, and of his other honours, traditional or novel, single or repeated. Intelligent people praised or criticised him in varying terms. One opinion was as follows: filial duty and a national emergency, in which there was no place for law-abiding conduct, had driven him to civil war, and this can be neither initiated nor maintained by decent methods. He had made many concessions to Antony and to Lepidus for the sake of vengeance on his father's murderers. When Lepidus grew old and lazy, and Antony's self-indulgence got the better of him, the only possible cure for the distracted country had been government by one man. However, Augustus had put the state in order not by making himself king or dictator, but by creating the Principate. The empire's frontiers were on the ocean or distant rivers. Armies, provinces, fleets, the whole system was interrelated. Roman citizens were protected by the law. Provincials were decently treated. Rome itself had been lavishly beautified. Force had been sparingly used merely to preserve peace for the majority. The opposite view went like this. Filial duty and national crisis had been merely pretexts. In actual fact, the motive of Octavian, the future Augustus, was lust for power. Inspired by that, he had mobilised ex-army settlers by gifts of money, raised an army while he was only a half-grown boy without any official status, won over a consul's brigades by bribery, pretended to support Sextus Pompeius, and by senatorial decree usurped the status and rank of a praetor.
So by giving that opposite view second, is he privileging that second opinion?
I think he is privileging that second opinion, but as so often with Tacitus, it's very hard to pin down to say he definitely is presenting the divine Augustus, who's, according to much of Roman historiography, is the good emperor before we get some of the bad ones, the example of what everyone else should have been doing. He offers that view, but then also offers the anti-Augustan, totally corrupt, or right from the start, the whole idea of the Principate was always bad opinion, and doesn't explicitly come down on one or the other. I guess we should also just note, I mean, we already mentioned a little bit with the Mary Beard quotation, just how extraordinary the Latin style is, which we can talk about in any of the passages we're talking about, but the sort of pointedness and the way that there are, on the syntactical level, parallels that aren't parallel, and also all these abstractions combined with concrete things, lists where there's no joining up, like a syndeton is one of his big rhetorical modes, and then these sort of balances which don't balance, which again sort of contrasts with the classics of earlier Latin prose style of Cicero or Livy, and it has this sort of confusing and constantly jarring quality, which I think goes with that question of, does it balance? Are there two sides to this question? Is there a way to figure it out? Or are we just going to be sort of constantly bombarded with irony and complexity? And it's hard to make sense of that.
I mean, on that question of balance and so on, that there's one point where he talks about steering away safe from intrigues and hazards between perilous insubordination and degrading servility, and that this is the way that senators and aristocratic Roman citizens ought to behave. Is there an assumption that that's partly what he's trying to do in his history, but also the way that he tried to live under Domitian, that he was himself the subject of one of these overbearing autocrats?
Right, and the fact that he'd survived presumably means that on some level he was complicit. So there's this question of, is he skewering all these feeble people who've been craven and bowed down to bad emperors, or is that just the only way to get through this?
Thanks for listening to this extract from Among the Ancients 2, a close reading series from the London Review of Books. To listen to the full episode and all our other close reading series, including Series 1 of Among the Ancients, sign up to our close reading subscription at lrb.me/close readings or click on the link in the description.